Tresch.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. Not early in the morning, but certainly earlier than maybe you'd choose to be. Well, for choosing to be here, thanks. I'm going to start at the very beginning with these first words and this first speech act, Fiat Lux, right? Let there be light, which divided two basic realms, light and dark, a matched pair that are always in conversation. And what I'm thinking about today and talking about is what happened when that power of speaking light into existence was taken out of the hands of the divine and put into the hands of humans like Humphrey Davy with his electric batteries illuminating the hall of the Royal Institution, or the illumination of the Place de Concorde in Paris, or eventually the standard illumination, the ongoing illumination of the works of humans like at the opera in Paris. And when that power of Fiat Lux becomes something that humans have control over, it's inevitable that the relationships between the natural world, humans, and the divine undergo some kind of shift. There's an alteration of the cosmological proportions and locations of these different actors as a result. And that's part of what I'm thinking of today, from the early 19th century, when that first became possible, up to the present. That becomes even more of a challenge and more of a cosmological stretch and transformation when the surface of the Earth is fundamentally changed by that set of technologies that make it so that our artificial night, our artificial daytime, is visible from the very reaches of space, from the stratosphere, and likewise when the alterations of the planet that we've done as part of that industrial transformation will be visible many generations from now, millions of years from now, on the surface of the Earth. So the connection between the Anthropocene and the transformation of night brought by electricity go hand in hand. I'm going to start with a modest theoretical intervention. From Graham Harman and Tim Morton yesterday, we've heard calls, and many other thinkers, to focus on units, on objects, these withdrawn objects that have one side facing us and one side always turning away, out of our reach, out of our access, which is opposed, in their arguing, to thinking of the whole, thinking of systems, thinking of anything undermining objects, underlying objects, processes of becoming, being as a whole. So they're saying, let's look at units and objects and not at wholes, not at systems. What I want to propose is a way of splitting the difference between those two poles, which is to look at times when people, yes, generally people, make an effort to represent the totality of the universe in a concrete form, whether that's a painting, a sculpture, a monument, a song, an epic poem. These are cosmograms, inscriptions of the order of the cosmos as a whole. And it's an object, but it's an object which is at the same time an attempt to grasp the totality of the universe. I think the term originally comes from religious studies to talk about things like the Ark of the Covenant, Buddhist mandalas, cathedrals. But it's important to note that science is also in the business of making cosmograms, whether it's Francis Bacon's frontispiece, Darwin's Tree of Descent, or cosmological epochs like Carl Sagan's Cosmos, recently updated on TV. What I want to do is bring those kinds of works of structuring the cosmos, representing the cosmos, making it something available for debate, for contestation, and for reworking. Take them from the domain of art, meaning, and religion, and compare them and contrast them and bring them into discussion with the ones that are coming from science, to show that science is not just about facts of the world as it is, but is also involved in producing narratives, structures of feeling, ways of shaping the milieu that we inhabit, just as much as religion and art is. And to think about the kinds of cosmograms we've built in the history of science and the ones that we might try to be shaping, which I think is part of what's going on in this conference as a whole, now that the cosmos itself seems to be undergoing shifts in the era of the Anthropocene, where the certainties of naturalism, of subjects on one side and objects on the other side, seem to be undermined in lots of ways, where Earth is no longer a passive, dead, mute actor, but now has a kind of agency, is awakening in the way that humans have always been thought to be awake and conscious, and that also the material, earthly aspect of humans is much more visible to our consciousness, much more part of how we think of where we are and where we might be. So I think it's a useful term now in the era of the Anthropocene. The underlying question is, how do we experience, relate to, and how might we adjust ourselves to a form of life in which nature is something that we can alter, both deliberately and with many unexpected consequences? Now, this is supposedly a brand new discovery of the Anthropocene, but actually it has a lot of earlier incarnations in the history of thought and comparatively cross-culturally. And I think we can benefit now if we are thinking about how to frame this new cosmos in comparing where we are and our representations of it with earlier cosmograms from other times. What diffraction patterns and feedbacks are sparked when humans take up this divine power of Fiat Lux, however recklessly or unpredictably, and when that power is answered by the earth? That's what I'm asking today. What maps and monuments and soundscapes do we share? How do we situate ourselves on these redrawn maps? So, looking at earlier cosmograms, earlier maps of the universe, devices for regulating the scale between the very small and the very large, the very short instantaneous and very long stretches of time, the deep time of geology, is one way of approaching these questions. And I'm going to look at two periods in particular. Ours, well, let's say three. Ours and a recent past that people have been thinking about quite a bit, the late 60s and early 70s, which seems to have a kind of magnetic pull to a lot of our thinking now. And then even further back, an earlier moment, the early 19th century, which some have seen as the dawn of the Anthropocene, the early industrial age, which is also the birth of Romanticism. And I think thinking about the constellation form between these periods, now 1971 roughly, the kind of end of the 60s, and the early 19th century, is a way of bringing back some ideas that can be useful for thinking the future. So first, 1971. I'm going to do four little episodes. This comes to mind because of a film that some of you may have seen, based on Thomas Pynchon's obsessive returning to the 1960s and thinking about what it means in 2009 when he wrote the book Inherent Vice. And the same kind of obsession seems to be there in the film by Paul Thomas Anderson that came out last year, based on the book. It features a bumbling, usually stoned private investigator, Doc Sportello, who stumbles into a conspiracy, not just about, as in Chinatown, how to take control of the water or the trolley and highways, like in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but now it's a grab for land and also for mental space, taken over by this mysterious boat on the edge of the horizon out on the sea, the Golden Fang, just beyond the shore. In the shadow of Rand Corporation and the Southern California aerospace industry, the Hollywood cultural industry, and especially the shadow of the Manson cult, the book explores how Nixon, Reagan, and others, and Orange County fascism are taking over and replacing the dreams and hopes of the late 1960s counterculture. The rubbish of consumerism is starting to bury the consumer. The hero has a prophetic LSD vision, Sportello. He imagines that an inhabitant of the lost, submerged city of Lemuria is walking him through a labyrinth of a city that both is and is not Los Angeles. So he's projecting Los Angeles as a future submerged city, imagining the shore, the water taking over the city. And when he returns, here's a quote, "Doc was left above the Pacific to find his way out of a vortex of corroded history, to evade somehow a future that seemed dark whichever way he turned. So it's a sunset to a civilization as a whole. It's a noir in sunshine with nighttime scenes of eerie neon and smog, headlights and TV glow. How the quote, psychedelic 60s, this little parenthesis of light, might close after and all be lost, taken back into darkness. So Pynchon is working a lot with chiaroscuro imagery, anticipating this sunset and wondering how this bright dawn turned to shadow. But this fall, told in this novel by Pynchon and shown in the movie, shouldn't be a big surprise to readers of Pynchon. Inherent Vice, the title, is really just another name for the original sin that Pynchon's ancestors brought with them to the shores of America. The certainty that this is a world of decay and degeneration, and only the extremely rare gift of divine act and fiat can allow anything to be preserved from ruin. And so it's a decidedly bleak vision, but it was bleak from the start. In this Puritan conception of nature and of human nature, there's really no chance except through the intervention of God. Now, sometime in the late 1960s, the real Thomas Pynchon met Brian Wilson, the shy and decidedly unstable mastermind of the Beach Boys, in his house in Bel Air. Wilson was trying to record this incompletable masterpiece, this album Smile, and was entertaining visitors in an Arabian tent he had built inside of his house. Pynchon and Wilson met. Wilson kept knocking over an oil lamp that he was trying to light. The two had nothing to say to each other. Literally, they did not exchange a word and just sat there in confused and anxious silence. But that meeting seems to hang over the book, Inherent Vice. The Beach Boys references in various zombified surf groups show up throughout the book and in the film. And it includes a Last Supper, which is a rewriting of the long goodbye of Chandler or Robert Altman into this both biblical and film noir register. Wilson's zombified state in 1971 is the contrary of the image he had laid down, of course, just a few earlier years before, of sunny Technicolor America. And you all know what that looks like and sounds like. Whoa. So I focused on the guy in orange, the drummer, Dennis Wilson, not least because he spent some time recording music with Charles Manson. So the sunset is already anticipated by this kind of overly bright Technicolor vision of ultra-capitalism from the extreme West. Endless summer via electric signal, bikini fashion lit up by nuclear flare, making a beach party from the closing of the frontier, the colonial fantasy extended into surf safari. But soon Wilson's bogged down after these scenes of endless summer, of conquering not just the land, but now the sea. Soon he's bogged down in the studio with all of his technology, all of his aspirations, unable to complete Smile. Nevertheless, some of the songs from this album showed up in a later record called Surf's Up that was kind of taken out of Brian Wilson's own hands, which has a title song, Surf's Up, which is a double entendre, right? On the one hand, listening back to that 1960s cowabunga of Surf's Up, get your boards and ride, but at the same time with the image of a defeated Indian warrior making us see the ending of the dream at the end of the coast. And the title song of the album is a kind of elegy of the American Empire. Even more compelling is the song before that, which is called Till I Die. It's an unsettling, depersonalizing immersion in the song, inspired by Brian Wilson's experience swimming at night. And I'm going to play the whole song for you. It's 3 minutes, so just so you can get a sense, because I think there's some weird feelings in the song that are worth actually sharing. Sorry, I meant to fade it out. It does fade out. So yeah, I think that was worth getting dunked into the middle of things, of Brian Vision's sonic vision, this kind of sonic cosmogram in which voices complete each other's lines, the wind is whispering above with reassurance and menace at the same time. So the self-determination of the pilgrim is annihilated by this identity with the earth. He becomes ocean, wind, and landslide. The geological imagination here makes for a very strange dream. No longer the cowabunga, there's no victory here. Instead of it's a waiting and repose, maybe even a longing for extinguishment. It's not a fall, but an expansion, a dissolution that isn't necessarily a loss. And what Pynchon shows as a fall from grace, I think resonates here as an unresolved state of betweenness, of feeling himself to be the ocean, the wind, the landslide. But if 2015, I think, echoes for Pynchon and Anderson with 1971, both of them are echoing earlier romanticisms, songs of innocence and experience, identifications with the earth and the ambiguity it brings. Most directly, perhaps, with Percy Shelley and his Ode to the West Wind, composed in 1819. West wind, breath of autumn's being, if I were a dead leaf you might hear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with you, lift me up as a wave, a leaf, a cloud, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Directly echoed by Wilson. What's compelling in both of these moments is the question of the affects brought to either by separation or identification with encompassing and elusive natural forces, our call to earth, earth's answer, and what the proper response ought to be. So I want to go back to the early 19th century, the period of Shelley, and think about how those identifications played out and what they were in contrast to, what they were fighting against. And This goes back, these kind of proto-Anthropocene identifications go back earlier to a long separation building between subjects and objects, built upon the explorations of matter and spirit of Renaissance magic, such as Robert Flood's here, but especially incarnated in English science, Thomas Burnet, and above all, Isaac Newton, and his mechanical philosophy, which depended upon and instituted a regime of facts and passive matter, held together by regular laws under the superintendence of an everywhere active, all-powerful God. Newton's natural theology and his view of matter as dead and passive went hand in hand. You needed to have passive matter in order for there to be something that God could have this ubiquitous, omnipotent power over. By the late 18th century, this scientific theology and its dead passive matter was the backdrop for the emergence of new theories about Earth's long history. William Buckland, shown here, bringing light into the depths of the Earth, excavating the planet to carve open passages for the railroad and for canals. People begin to see the strata and the specific fossils at each of the levels of the strata, which seem to show a much deeper time history of the Earth, long before humans, than you would find in Genesis. The questions raised here are massive. How long had the Earth existed? How long had the wind blown? Why did there appear to be new species at distinct intervals? Was there a cycle of rising and falling and rising again, or continuous phases punctuated by catastrophes? And were there uniform laws at work on Earth and in the solar system? Or was life and human thought necessarily the creation of the special intervention, the miraculous intervention of the Creator? These were cosmological questions and cosmopolitical questions in the sense of Isabel Stengers and Bruno Latour. And while Anglican and Calvinist natural philosophers insisted, like Newton, on grounding their cosmos on a separation between dead matter and the free will and omnipotence of humans and God, and more on them in a moment, from the late 18th century onward, against that view, a number of vital materialisms were shimmering. These philosophies took matter as capable of all the spontaneity, creativity, and even life and thought attributed to God and souls. Chemist and philosopher Joseph Priestley, who was at the center of circles in London that included William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, and William Blake, insisted that matter had active self-organizing properties and in the proper arrangement could produce life and thought. Priestley also brought out the political implications of this view of matter. Anglican theology, he said, made matter dumb and passive and required superior management by God or by God's intended ministers. Priestley saw matter, like the subordinate classes in England, as entirely capable of directing themselves. Now, matter's unchained energies fueled the poems and prophecies of his colleague, William Blake. The songs of Innocence present the fragile confusion, the brief eternity of childhood, the simple tales that rock the cradle. In Night, for instance, children nest watched by angels who keep away wolves and tigers in this panel. But Songs of Experience contemplates the fearsome symmetry of the tiger and other creatures of a much less meek framer, a London where children die of hunger when not worked to death. It begins with a song of the bard to renew fallen light. He ends up calling out to the earth, O earth, return, turn away no more. Why wilt thou turn away? The starry floor, the watery shore is given thee till break of day. It's a world upside down, a floor of stars. To try to awaken this earth, it needs to be stood back on its feet. And in response, the earth answers. She raised up her head at last from stony dread, her infinite energies imprisoned by the, quote, selfish father of the ancient men, dominated by cruel, jealous, selfish fear, which traps love and delight in the chains of false perception and narrow prudishness. Break this heavy chain that does freeze my bones around. Selfish, vain, eternal bane, that free love with bondage bound. The imprisoning patriarch is not only the Ancient of Days or Moses, with his tables of stone, but the Satanic Trinity of Bacon, Locke, and above all, Newton, whose act of separation with his compass upon his own scroll resulted in the smothering single vision, which we see only through chinks of the cavern. Blake sees the earth as stone only by default, by limitation, where political and emotional liberation would mean unleashing the energies that we share with the earth, awakening our own bodies along with those of our milieu and the sustaining earth that we're part of. And Newton is portrayed as one of the chief wardens of our prison and the earth's prison. So to go back to Shelleys Ode, we saw the first verses and compared them to Wilson's Till I Die. But in the end of this poem, there's a switch, a difference from Wilson. It actually is a prayer, an incantation, a wish to be an instrument of this animated force, the west wind. Be thou me, spirit fierce, my spirit, impetuous ones, in order that his thoughts may race across the universe to set fire to humanity, to awaken the earth as a whole, to make Shelley into a trumpet of prophecy. If winter comes, can spring be far behind? Shelley wants to awaken the conscience of humanity against an increasingly repressive government and labor regime in the massacre scene in 1819, the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, which is the year he wrote the poem. It's the same year he wrote Prometheus Unbound, a play in which the demigod is freed and bestows an even greater gift than fire to humans, which is a world without fear, without class, hierarchy, or worship. So his call, Shelley's call to reawaken the shared matter of earth and humans, aimed to stoke the real fear of revolution in England in the 1780s and again around 1830, coming from the continent, coming from France. He wants to see happen in England something like what has happened in France. And I want to look in a little more detail at France, which is offered enabling conditions for the kind of vital materialism that Shelley, Blake, Godwin, and Priestley were encouraging in England. But in France, this was able to take off on a much bigger scale with much more consequences, taking the form of a popular pantheism that really set the backdrop for socialism and for the revolution of 1830 and of 1848. In France, there had been deep traditions of math and engineering. After Napoleon's defeat, it rushed to catch up with the steam technology of England, but at the same time, it brought in philosophy and art from Germany, which had been censored before, connected with Naturphilosophy, with Romanticism, with Schelling. These philosophies of nature merged together, the mechanical and the romantic, producing an obsession with new kinds of technologies that would tap into the latent forces of the earth, focused on daguerreotypes, machines for shaping perceptions, as well as steam engines and electricity. All were seen as woven into the earth and bringing about transformations and conversions among different forms of energy, different forms of matter, and also creating a new humanity and a new nature, such as in the work of Charles Fourier and a number of other utopian thinkers. It was the age of new kinds of spaces, new kinds of sensations in the arts, the Parisian Grand Opera with its collective hallucination of light and dark, silence and sound, the use of electricity to illuminate, and as in the opera of Meyerbeer, The Prophet, to blind an audience with new kinds of sights. This set the stage, or it was part of the era of panoramas as well, these immersive experiences affecting all the senses, bringing people direct contact with distant lands and experiences they wouldn't have had otherwise. This set the stage for scientific developments, including Humboldt's early ecology, his geological physics, but also political and scientific movements, such as that of the Saint-Simonians, who dreamed of large-scale public works, engineering, railroads, electricity, that would bring about a new heaven and a new earth and a new social order. They concentrated their utopia on a single cosmogram, a new temple that would replace the Cathedral of Notre Dame, this electric lady at the center of Paris, which would be a temple that's a voltaic battery made of magnets, melody, and harmony. It would contain the life of the earth, the life of the sun, the life of men. What an immense communion. What a gigantic moralization of a whole people. They retold Genesis as the earth being a living being that went through successive transformations, the last of which was humanity and humanity's technologies, a natural outgrowth of the Earth's own development, with all the light, steam, and power, part of the Earth's own developmental trajectory. Auguste Comte, the founder of positivism, also invented a religion along the lines of the Saint-Simonians, with new saints. Here's Gutenberg representing industry, a new church, new rituals, and new fetishes. At the end of his life, he wrote the Subjective Synthesis, which was offered new objects of worship: the great being of humanity, the great fetish of the earth, right, which sustains us, and the great milieu, which is the empty space that makes knowledge possible. All of these were put forward as new animistic gods, acknowledged to be fictions, but necessary so that humans might have some force to focus their attentions on in order to develop the term he coined, altruism, which is love, devotion, and benevolence toward the other. But for Comte, the other is not just humans, but the earth itself, as well as the milieu, the environment, the underlying ground upon which being manifests. So this is some weird stuff from the middle of the 19th century. These doctrines fueled the revolution of 1848. They were the background for the workers' revolution, and their grandiosity wasn't lost on contemporaries. People saw them as leading to, they tried too much too soon, right? It was a utopian vision that went too far and was easily suppressed by the coup d'etat of Napoleon III. But it's worth looking at these earlier visions, these popular pantheisms. It was not a romanticism of nostalgia in this period. It wasn't a flight into nature or imagination. Rather, they reckoned the earth as a mutual partner, engaged and negotiated through discrete and assembled technologies. There's no nature to get back to, they said, and also no artifice to flee if everything breathes, if everything is entangled with everything else. Meanwhile, back in England, against such visions, the natural theologians are working very hard to secure the rule of God and the Tory government that they support, and to do so, they insist on the passivity and deadness of matter. This is concentrated particularly in a series of books called the Bridgewater Treatises, which were written in 1833 against the encroaching pantheism that's coming from France and from Romanticism, actually, within England, including the preacher Chalmers, who says nature itself contains the rudiments of decay. If God's not there, matter will collapse. Buckland, the geologist, explaining geology in terms of natural theology. And above all, William Whewell, the astronomer and philosopher, who says, yes, there may be development in the world. Yes, the world may be understood as a machine, but in order to make sense of that machine, you still need to have someone who started it. If there is light, someone first has to have created that light. So what is striking in the case of the British natural theologians of this period, what we can draw from it, is the fact that what now passes as scientific common sense, the idea that matter is dead, passive, unthinking, inert, okay, which we take for granted as just what's reasonable. Anything else would be whimsical and delirious. That vision of matter was the accomplishment of a series of extremely defensive Anglican theologians. Okay? We are the inheritors of this theological invention of a dead matter created so that God has something to do in a scientific universe. Right? And I think both the theology as well as the theory of matter are both things that we can start to think beyond. And the Anthropocene is something that pushes us beyond that particular way of mapping the cosmos. So I want to end with a final coda to go back to some of the inheritors of Brian Wilson, some of the children of the Beach Boys, people who explored similar sonic landscapes and similar geological imaginations after him. Spacemen 3, for instance, really spend a lot of time thinking about those last albums and recreate them, of the Beach Boys, and recreate them with the whole apparatus of phasers, flangers, and studio equipment, DIY studio equipment. Their opiated lines of flight do seem to head toward black holes in many cases. I'm particularly interested in Not Spiritualized, which is a band which branched off from Spaceman 3, but the work of Sonic Boom, another performer in Spaceman 3, who's been working with a younger artist named Panda Bear recently, Panda Bear was in Animal Collective and did a few solo records since then, which I think also embody an interesting take on the geological imagination. His most recent album from this year is co-produced with Sonic Boom. It's called Panda Bear versus the Grim Reaper. So heavy topics are on his mind, his own death and the death of the earth as well. He's definitely thinking about geology in it. And I'm going to play again a song, a couple minutes of song, immerse you in it, because I think this is an audiovisual cosmogram that in some ways is echoing, but also taking us a step out of that confusing interspace of Brian Wilson's Till I Die. So this is called Boys Latin, and I think it's a play on the childhood languages, the private languages of childhood, turned into a new kind of cosmological script. So there's a happy ending. What we've got in this script is a sense of a woman walking through a landscape snagged by this anemone, the bite of an apple, wrenched from innocent self-possession into a terrifying otherness where she is part of something much more than her. She recovers and finds a way to incorporate that invasion, this crossing of her membranes, and marches on. She meets someone else caught in the same vertigo and is able to help him to find his own harmonic, his own way to walk through the same landscape, no longer separate from him. A new multiple being is formed. Now, I'm not against happy endings, even Hollywood ones, which wind up with the formation of the nuclear couple. And I think in this case, it's something like what Hannah Arendt talks about in asserting the way in which natality guarantees renewal. Something new will happen by the fact that children are born. But this time, it's not in the frame of the human condition, but an other than human condition, a more than human condition. If we're part of the earth, to awaken that starry floor, that watery shore, is to awaken ourselves and each other. But we don't know what or when that dawn will be. So I want to end just by rephrasing Voltaire's notion of we must cultivate our garden, or put that in a new light. If we are the garden, cultivating that garden becomes a very different kind of proposition. If we are both the thing observing and cultivating and the thing observed and cultivated. And this seems to be a modest but necessary adjustment to prepare for whatever sun or sunset might be coming next, to allow ourselves to sink into what we are. Ocean, landslide, wind, without knowing what any of them will be, and to try to remember to have a good time at the same time. Thank you.